This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and believe it or not, this is show number 10 of the One Human Nation show. And this is an opportunity for us to get together and talk about that touchy subject of race in a safe, honest, open, and productive environment. The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So as we start the day's program, I do want to refresh, if you haven't picked up any of the promotional items happening on Facebook, that this is part 2 of a 2-part show. So if you feel a little bit lost, be sure, if you haven't already done that, go back and catch the part 1 that was broadcasted on June 8th, last Thursday. So we're going to have the guests calling back in today in about 15 minutes to share kind of where they are now in this journey of adopting 2 African-American males by white males and what that has looked like. So we're not going to do a lot of recap from the first show because I want you to go and listen to that show. But there are a couple of things that we do want to touch on before our guest calls in, because it's always ongoing for us to be aware of internal culture. So one of in the iceberg culture of what we talk about, and that's that visual of the iceberg where you see above the iceberg watermark, that tip of the iceberg, that's the external culture. That's the things that we see visually, that's pretty obvious, whether it's food or flags or festivals, performances, how someone dresses, language. And then there's the deep culture, the subculture. And what we're really getting into on this particular show and the previous show is the subculture. It's the things you don't know about a culture. And it's more than thinking you speak the same language. So I discovered this in trying to learn Spanish and being in Texas for over 30 years. You'd think I would have gotten it by then. But growing up in Savannah, Georgia, Spanish wasn't the language I took. I took, believe it or not, French and German. So I tried to learn Spanish. I took lessons when I was in Texas, but it's more than learning the language. You really have to immerse yourself in the culture so that you're not saying anything or doing anything that's creating a problem with the very people that you're trying to communicate with. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about in more detail on this show is that African-American subculture. This is a subculture of Africans of the diaspora. So I do want to make this distinction right now because I've had people ask the question, well, should we say black or should we say African-American? It really kind of depends on the person, and it depends on who you're referring to. If you're referring to someone that's really from a country in Africa, from the continent of Africa, then I think they would find it offensive if you refer to them as an African American, because they're not. So if you said black, if you said African, that may, that's part of the getting to know that communication with the internal culture. But we're talking specifically about adoptions that occurred with African Americans by white males in this country. So part of preparing for that, because this show is going to, Stephen, our guest, is going to share some things about now they're entering the teen years. They adopted these babies when they were very young, and one is 12 and the other is 13. So we all know when we hit the teenage years, some very interesting things happen anyway. So it's some context that we want to give. And so one of the things I like to do, and this gets to the productive part of the show, is really kind of looking at some data. So one article that I ran across, and it was published in the New York Times, and it was based on a report that was done. And the title of it was Black Babies, Boys Less Likely to be Adopted. And it goes on to talk about the research, the data that they analyzed from June 2004 to August 2009, and they reference that, paper that they're referencing. And the authors found that girls are consistently preferred to boys. For non-African American babies, for example, the probability that a prospective adopted parent has an interest in a baby is 11.5% more interest if the baby is a girl, and it drops to 7.9% if the baby is a boy. And what they did reference is that in many cultures, if it's a biological child, the preference is to have a boy instead of a girl, and we can kind of figure out, why that is the case. It goes on to state, additionally, Caucasians and Hispanics are consistently preferred to African Americans. The probability that a non-African American baby will attract the interest of an adopted parent is at least 7 times as high as a corresponding probability for an African American baby. So that was very interesting. So you get a context of who's more likely to be in the adoption market. And the other part of this is, so there's some additional statistics, and it gets into I like sometimes to see percentages, even though I'm not, totally big in the numbers, but I thought this was interesting, and it's going to speak to the guest that's going to be calling in. And it gets into analyzing adopted children's social and emotional well-being. So it states that 9% of adopted children age 2 and above are more than likely they're going to be diagnosed with depression, and that statistics goes down for all other children, 4%. So children that are not adopted, 4%. Percentage that are diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, 26% for adopted, and 10% for those that are not adopted. And the statistics for if they were ever diagnosed with behavior conduct problems, 15% for adopted children, 4% for all other children. Problem with social behaviors, 14% for adopted children, 9% for all other children. Exhibits positive social behaviors, 88% for adopted children, which seems to be pretty good. 94% for all other children. So I think it's always good to look at things in context as far as, what's going to, what does the data show over a period of time? And of course, we can find out from the guest that's going to be calling in is, how prepared were they for some of the medical issues as well as emotional issues. Were things very clear as far as what their expectations should be. And so the other information that I found that I thought was pretty interesting is just kind of a general definition of what are attachment disorders. And so they talk about some of the basic characteristics. And for those of you that like to look at data, this was from a website called attachmenttraumanetwork.org. attachmenttraumanetwork.org. And it lists some of the characteristics or signs that a person struggles with attachment. And these are history of abandonment, neglect, abuse, and or multiple placements, indiscriminately seeks affection and or comfort from strangers, antisocial behaviors, and they give examples like lying, stealing, manipulating, destructiveness, cruelty, fire setting, aggression, lack of authenticity, spontaneity, flexibility, and empathy, lack of physical affection and closeness, and or inappropriate clinginess, poor eye contact, problems with learning, attending, self-regulating, self-monitoring, and abnormal eating, and then they say elimination patterns, which, would be bedwetting, stalling, or even like hoarding food. So I think it's interesting, before our guest calls in, which should be happening in about 5 minutes or so, that we have a context. Because remember, this show is talking about the impact of the stories we hear about race, what we're exposed to, what our environment has been like. And this is both sides of the fence. So it doesn't matter whether you're a white or a person of color. It's how have these interactions impacted, and what is it going to take for us to move through a process of reconciliation, of healing, to get to justice. Because until we do that, it's going to be very difficult, in my opinion, that we do become one human nation. So that's what the show is all about. What does it take for us to become one human nation? And I think a huge part of it is that we share our stories, no matter how difficult, no matter how painful, and we learn our history. And our history is a history as a human species. That's the first thing, that there is not a species for African Americans. There's not a species for Latinos, whether it's Mexican or Puerto Rican or Cuban. There's not a species for Native Americans or Asian Americans. We are one human species. One human species. And race, that thing that we call race, was something that was created. So one of the tools that we use through the One Human Race series is really looking at a documentary that really broke this down, this whole discussion of race in our history, into 3 different parts. And some of those clips, I do have posted on the website. But if you're tuning in or you haven't had an opportunity to go to the website, if you just go to YouTube and even Google race, the power of an illusion, these videos will come up, the clips come up. And sometimes they have the entire episode, and sometimes they only have the clips. And the clips are what I have posted at the One Human Nation website, and you can go to onehumannation.info. And keep in mind, as we talk about our stories, as we continue to move forward with additional episodes, if you see something that sparks your interest or that you would like to talk about in more detail, the way to contact me is via email at mystory@onehumannation.info. So we're going to get, when you hear the phone ring, that means I'll be taking the call from Stephen, our caller, calling in. And so I wanted just to give us some background information, some prep to keep in mind, to get things into context. And this is all about a learning experience. So I do want to refer to what we mentioned as part of our communication agreements. When we're telling our story, we want to speak our truth using I statements and realizing that everyone is at a different place on their journey of understanding the idea of race in this country. There may be something that you hear that's very emotional, so take care of yourself. And this is the part of the communication agreement that I really love with the One Human Race series is the divine can be found in the tension. So there's our caller, and we're going to go to a break.
the 13-year-old is 6 feet tall and 160. Yeah, no, I'm shrinking and he's growing. So yeah, he looks down at me. Not metaphorically, of course,
Okay, I think we're back on. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yeah. Where did I end up on that?
Their godmother that, so let me just back up. So we were at the point of talking about their godmother who, something was said and she basically made the comment, oh, you better be lucky that you're being raised by, white males, because if you're being raised by me, you would, it would be a whole different story.
Are we on now?
Okay.
Are we on?
Stephen, let me just make sure that everyone can hear you. So can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
So based on that, there is a difference, I think, in how Black children are raised. Why don't you share with us kind of what you've noticed kind of entering into the teen years? And this is going to tie directly into, I think, really getting into that subculture of the language that that we don't, you may not hear anything about, and you think it's all English, and then finding out that, wait a minute, what's going on here that we're not communicating, or there's some other language out there that seems to be more attractive than the language you're talking to them in.
Yes, absolutely. Well, one of the things I was trying to demonstrate with the story about their godmother was deep down in that iceberg is that John and I did not have, when we realized when she said she would drop them where they stood, we realized that not only was that not how we were capable of parenting, but we also didn't really have a right to parent that way or a privilege to parent that way, if you understand what I'm saying, because of us being white and them being of color. And we got that message more than one time. If I was very stern with the boys in public, there were times when I would get looks from especially African American males, and I think that it harkens back to that white privilege, and so it just wasn't okay for me to deal with my children that way. And in the teenage years, it became it also what didn't seem to be effective. But in the teenage years, I had to deal with my children in a way that was physically nonviolent, not necessarily always verbally nonviolent. But as they began to get bigger and bigger, there was this thought of what happens when this child is angry and he's much larger than me. And we've arrived at that point now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that Eli started into puberty at 10. Eli started everything early.
Okay.
And the trauma that we talked about last week that Eli experienced before he came to us, the medical trauma and the neglect and the failure to thrive,
right,
was deeply inside him in a nonverbal way, and he would find himself in fight or flight mode.
Okay.
And he wouldn't know why, and there was no reason that was evident. And all of a sudden, I'm dealing with a child who's angry, and it was, could you feed the dog? And what I understand now is that in that period of trauma when he was young, his brain received so much cortisol.
Yes.
And it actually caused his brain to develop differently in the executive function front, and that was the reason why he wasn't reacting the way that the situation looked like, and it became difficult in schools too, because people would try to deal with Eli in a behavioral fashion, and it was not a behavioral problem. It was a core. It was a core issue, and if you tried to deal with it in the normal way that you would handle that kind of behavior from a child, you would make it worse.
Right.
and you would make him really move to a place where he had to defend.
Right. So, based on what I've, experienced with, having to medicate children, is that the direction y'all had to go with Eli, is to get him some medication to try? And I think we talked about that a little bit last week, that was not something that you ever wanted to do.
No, it wasn't, but it did become necessary. And at first it was ADHD medication, and we tried the normal things that were stimulants, and they were a disaster for Eli. And we found something else that wasn't a stimulant. But as we kept going with this, and as Eli got further into adolescence, it became clear that he wasn't really able to make good, safe choices all the time.
Right.
And that he wasn't able to have a pause before he did something, the
right.
impulsivity and the things. And so when we first entered the psychiatric world,
right.
and that's when the medicine started to come. And at this point, I don't know if your listeners know, but we've been in a really tough situation in the last few weeks, and I did actually put Eli in a treatment center for trauma and attachment.
Okay.
And grief disorder.
And I know when we talked, Stephen, you mentioned it was, he was so fascinated with some of what I guess we would call the rowdy kids, because of, just there was like a whole nother language and culture that he was attracted to that is just not good. It is definitely, I think, one reason why there's such an attraction to the gang life for a lot of kids that don't feel attached to knowing their family, knowing their history, and then on top of that, you've had trauma in early years. So I do think there is a connection somewhere in really figuring out, and having our children know, what's their history, and really, when I say ancestral history, all the way back through slavery, because remember, the show is about one human race. So what impact has slavery had generation after generation after generation after generation, when you've got that stress related to the cortisol that's being released, and that's part of the whole. And
that was really the state of the people that were suffering through that time.
Exactly.
And I think that it does. I think that kind of stress comes down genetically through generations. I'm not a doctor, but it looks like it to me. Well, and I can't tell you how angry Eli was when he started to learn about that kind of thing.
Yes, and they, I like to compare it to a study that was done by the Canadians with the Holocaust survivors and their children, and they actually have information out there. It's very easy to access, and the title of this particular article that I came across was "Descendants of Holocaust Survivors Have Altered Stress Hormones." And so the studies are there. This is what they noticed, and this is decades ago. And it's really about survival when it's passed from generation to generation. Because if the mother is pregnant, then all of that's going to be passed on to the children. And they even break it down to what happens if the father or grandfather didn't have access to food, and it just kind of really just breaks down to a level that I think, and maybe this is already happening, but I think we do have to take a closer look at our ancestral history, because, in using my I voice, which is what I like to request for people to do when we tell our stories, is when I'm in a stressful situation, sometimes I react a certain way, and I don't even really know why I reacted that way. And I have to really take a moment to think about, and sometimes it may be like, you know what, I don't know why I did that, but I do believe it's connected to what happened to my ancestors a long time ago, that, through the slavery and what happens. But getting back to your
and how you move in and out of fight and flight and survival.
Exactly. And how do you weave that into day-to-day living and functioning on a job, and driving in your car and going to the grocery store, because I do, and I feel like I was very lucky in the environment that I was raised in. I didn't realize how lucky I was, but I was very lucky, and in some of my neighbors that we grew up together, we were kind of in our own little bubble, and we weren't rich by any means, but we had a sense of who we were.
And see, that's what's missing sometimes for all adopted children.
Right.
But adopted children handle that differently. But when you have a child like Eli that had the stress to begin with, and then feels deeply the loss of his mother.
Right.
And I have his brother is from a similar situation, but he doesn't. I mean, yes, he sometimes has questions about his mother, but he doesn't feel this very present grief and loss.
So let me. I don't want to interrupt you, but a quick question. So let me just clarify for the listeners, because you're referring to them as brothers. Are they biological brothers?
No.
Okay. Yeah. Because and I know you clarified that in the first show, but I just want to make sure if somebody's tuning in for the first time, because that to me speaks.
Well, I think that's an important point. They
right.
were not a sibling group. No.
Right. So your youngest, who's 12, is handling things differently.
Yeah. And he may, when he's 16, he may experience similar kinds of things, but currently in the way he is, he's very comfortable and feels safe in the home. He doesn't do as well out in the world as Eli does. Well, that's not true. He doesn't do as well here. And I think it was what you were talking about, the teenage stuff, especially because middle school is difficult for anyone.
Right.
But for me to bring these kids that have been raised, middle class white, upper middle class white, with people of color as role models from the same economic class.
Right.
And then all of a sudden be in a situation where they are around all of a sudden so many people that look like them, instead of, how Austin is 8 or 9%
African American now, yes.
And now they're in a population that's 30% African American or 32% African American.
Right.
And they both came from the same place, and Eli was drawn right towards it. And Simon, sort of ran away from it. But Eli went to the part because he's looking for that identity because of the loss he feels around his birth family. He went to a sort of a dangerous place with that.
Right.
And he went to a place where all of a sudden he felt like he had brothers, and he had. He was. You know how you kind of get there. There's a community that's built in, and all of a sudden you feel like there's an instant community around you.
Right. And they're accepting you for who you are, and that they understand you, and they look like you. So,
except that Eli didn't really understand them. But
that's right.
He's good at taking on others.
Masking.
So he was able to do it, but Simon wasn't. But that also put Eli in a position that was not safe for him too. And
on that note, and I'm sorry to break right here, but can you hold that thought, Stephen? Because I do need to take a break for just a couple of announcements, but we're going to come back. So please stay on the line, and we're going to take a couple of announcements for our sponsors. So hold on, and we'll be right back with you.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Sounding's programming is made possible by a grant from Sentient Bean, offering fair trade coffee, vegan and vegetarian food, and breakfast all day. Located at 13 East Park Avenue, across the street from the tennis courts at Forsyth Park. Our menu and special events listings can be found at sentientbean.com.
As a business, if you enjoy our programming on WRUULP, please support the station with a donation. Let your customers, neighbors, and friends know that you share our vision of building a thriving community based on diverse, vibrant radio programming. As a business partner, our listeners will know you support Savannah's only broad-based community radio station. Become a tower sponsor or underwriter. To check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/corporate. Again, to check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/corporate. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUU LP. WRUULP is Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. So we're going to go back with our guest speaker and kind of pick up on this conversation that we are currently talking about. So, Stephen, are you there?
I am.
Okay. And I'm sorry, that was kind of like one of those points. If I didn't break then, that wouldn't give us enough time to get through the next. I want to give us like at least another 10 minutes to try to get through this. But
well, and I guess the thing that really is salient about this particular direction that we're speaking is that this is a child who had this deep trauma and grief, and he has these issues of loss around his adoption, and he's a teenager, and he has all of that, plus he has testosterone and adrenaline flowing through his veins, and he is starting to move in a community that he doesn't have any history with, and he's searching for his own history in that way, too. Not that he didn't have it, with his adoptive family, but now he's looking this other way. And so he's moving through this community in fight or flight and fear. I mean, there's a lot of it that's really amazing sensory things, but a lot of it's dangerous.
Right. And,
he's trying to play like he knows, and he didn't know, and we were so scared for him.
Right.
Because of that.
And I think part of that, and it's just compounded with what he's going through and what they're going through, is I think as teenagers, we just think we know and we're invincible anyway. Mm-hmm. We just think that's, adults don't know anything and we know everything, and everybody else that's an adult is really, I don't want to say the word stupid, but I mean, really, that's what we think. We just think they're clueless, or if you want to use not hip or whatever, it's like, you don't understand. And I can remember times when, my mom would say to me, well, why did you do, and really, I had no idea why I did what I did. I knew it was going to cause me a world of hurt, because she was not going to tolerate it. But I could not verbalize, there's just too much going on. You don't know. And so now when I hear kids say, I don't know why I did, I don't know. I mean, I really think they don't know.
No, I believe that's absolutely true.
But I think
and that's why we have to protect them, and some of them more than others of them.
Right. So what are some of the things you're doing? I know you said the past couple of weeks have been really kind of a critical stage. So what are some of the things that you're looking into besides including the rehab center?
It's a residential treatment. Well, he has a therapy group here in Nashville, and they'll be working with the center. But we've been in treatment. I'm not in treatment. We've been in therapy for long periods of time, and I think that Eli is only now old enough to really begin to understand what may have happened to him.
Okay.
And to understand why it is that his story took the direction that he took. And I'm hoping that he's old enough this time that when these people try to help him go deep inside and pull this stuff out,
right,
and look at it, and understand that you're not really even reacting to that, you're reacting to the feelings. So, you've got to get to the feelings before you can get to that. And I'm very hopeful that he's going to get some help where he is. And you know, the last weeks have been hard, but it's also been a period of time when he and I moved closer, because he saw what he did. He saw the things that he did, and he couldn't believe. He didn't know where all of that was coming from, this rage, and it scared him. Right. And that's why I'm hopeful that he's ready to listen to somebody else, not me, but
right. Well, and you know, I kind of talked about this. So, does he have any relations with his, I guess, maternal side of the family? I mean, does he have any relations
with his birth mother?
Yes.
No. She closed it up. Okay. And so, you know, the ethical spirit of the agreement is that we won't, you know, come from our side to try and find her. Although I've been tempted many times, and I don't think it would be that hard. But right now, there's no therapist or psychiatrist recommending that would be a stabilizing force. Okay. But I believe that he has the right to that. And I don't know that he needs to wait till he's 18 to get that right. But, you know, the court says one thing and everybody says another thing. But if it comes to my child and, you know, and keeping him safe, if he needs that, then I'll try to provide that for him. Okay. And I think that families, I mean, I believe that he needs to know who his family is, who his siblings are. He needs to be reconnected with that. And I don't think that giving him that will threaten his relationship with me in any way, or with John. Right. Or with Simon. I mean, it might take him from that direction away from us for a while. Right. But that would be because he would finally searching. Get to know who he was. Yes. Yeah. So I don't want to feel like we're leaving your 12-year-old out of the discussion, but it sounds like he's just not having that identity issue. I asked him, I said, Simon, why don't you ever ask us questions about your mother, or why don't you ever talk about your mother? Do you think about her? He said, I do think about her. He said, but those are private thoughts. And I said, okay, but you know that you can talk to her if you want to. And he said, I do, Papa. I know that I can talk to you, but that's not what I want right now. So, okay. Well, he wants to feel comfortable in his world, and he doesn't want. He's not ready. He's not ready to rock the boat, right? There's already enough drama. Right? Yeah, he already sees his older brother going through stuff. And he's like, you know what, I'm not ready to go through that yet. But to kind of link back in as we finish up our chat, I do want to leave the listeners with this picture of the cultural iceberg, and I know you've looked at this before, because what we're talking about is the deep culture that you weren't even aware of, even though you were exposed to some of it when you worked at the club that we'd mentioned in the other show. In Austin, which was kind of a highbrow place to work, and you were working there as a wait person, so you were technically peers with them, but still not quite there, that kind of deal, because you were white and they were black, the folks you were working with. So some of the things that we're talking about as far as subculture, and we're talking about masking, and a huge part of that is the language, as well as I think tone of voice gets to be a huge part of that, as far as the way you tease, the way you express with your physical body. Right. And it sounds like part of what is really the hard part for your oldest is really the concepts of fairness and justice. And, he's realizing as, he gets older, just by the color of his skin, he's got
for a better way of putting it, it's unfair. And he has no control over the fact that this is what you were born into. This was the body you were born into, and he hasn't learned, because those were, even though he hasn't learned how to adjust to that.
No, and he doesn't have a concept that it's dangerous either. You know, we have given him the talk that every parent gives to their African American son, you know, and we give it over and over and over again, that you don't have the privilege of acting a certain way in public because it's dangerous to you.
Right.
And so, yes, you're right. He's in the middle of all of that. Everything about his life, from beginning to end, it's all swirling around in a stew right now. And somehow we've got to pull him out of it in a positive way, so that not only can he be safe with himself and others, but that he can thrive and have a beautiful, positive self-image. And we need a village to do that.
Right.
We can't do it just ourselves.
Right. And I know you've moved, from Austin to Nashville. So have you been able to connect to some of the cultural activities that may be helpful? Because I am a big believer in being immersed in the culture of, and I would think in Nashville that would be possible, or is it a more, because I have a point of reference because we both lived in Austin. So is it, and it's different, I would think, in the South, because I still consider Austin Southwest. I don't really consider it Southern. But
this is different than Austin.
Right.
And it's more segregated. I mean, even in school, if you're on a sports team or if you're in a club, there's, people work together in that way. But in the lunchroom, I look in the lunchroom and I see the tables, and I see the white kids at one table and the black kids at another table. And I see a little tiny bit of crossover, but that's also something that neither of my boys understand.
Right.
So, but I have to tell you that that I think that adoption industry, I hate to say it that way, but I think the adoption community and world is becoming more aware of what they need to help parents understand what they're facing and help prepare parents to do better for the kids.
Right, and that's I'm glad you brought that up. Right, because I do want to cover that and touch base on that, because I know from what you've told me before, y'all were prepared for, you got the talk from for want of a better word, the adoption industry about the medical issues that you would be facing, but that really didn't happen until now. You're seeing that, and it was all of the other immersion in the culture stuff. And I think
there was no training at all. I mean, literally, this was 2004, I guess.
Right.
But there is beginning to be better. But there's also a shift in the way courts and judges and social workers are looking, and family placements are becoming more important. They're overriding other concerns, and there's a strong push among African American social workers and adoption community that black kids should be placed with black families when possible. And I don't know if that's right or wrong. I think my children would have had a different road if they were placed that way. At the time, there were more African American kids looking for a home than there were people willing to adopt them.
Right.
And I think that that's also an economic issue too, because I think that there are families of color and lower income white families that really want to adopt. Right. But financially, it's very difficult, because when a child's in foster care, you get tons of support.
Right.
And you can get therapists and doctors, and you get all kinds of things. And once you adopt,
right,
then all of that burden falls on you. And so it kind of is a disincentive,
right,
to make a permanent family. So there's so many things to figure out for these kids.
Right. And so on that note, is there something, as we kind of wrap up with you, is there something that you wish you had known? I know you would adopt your sons regardless. I mean, I know you love your boys, that's not even where this question is going, but is there something that you wish you had known then that you would like to share with the listeners that you would have done differently?
The one thing I think that I would have done differently, and it only applies to one of my children because my younger child was CPS, and it's impossible. But I would have pushed harder for an open adoption or some connection with the mother, because we were willing to do that and we offered to do that.
Okay.
But we didn't get a positive response. And remember, she was gone 2 months from the hospital by the time we met Eli.
Right.
But I think that maybe if I had pushed the adoption agency harder, we could have asked for that to be revisited.
Interesting. Okay.
So I think and the rest of it I know from my life is that if I go back and start changing things, then my life is different now in ways that.
And we don't get that. It doesn't matter for any of us. We don't get back to replay the past. And if we get into that loop, there are things that I would be like, God, if I would have known that then, I would have done things a little bit differently. But no, none of us get the opportunity to do that. But I wish you all the best as you guys continue to go through this. And all you can do at some point is, pray it up and wish that the outcome is going to be what the outcome is going to be. And I know we've had that conversation off the air about the spiritual base and how that's important to this journey that you're on. And so, but I'm. I know it's tough, and I think it's tough for teenagers. And I just, I do know a couple that are African American, and they adopted after having 2 children. They adopted another child. The third child is a black girl, but they have some challenges also. So that child is having to, and it's so in some ways, what I'm trying to say about that, Stephen, is the problem was already there before the adoption occurred. So, and I know you don't think that there was something you did or didn't do that you should have, so I
might have used to think that, but I know that's not true anymore.
Yeah. So.
No, that's not true.
Yeah. I just want to leave that with the listeners, and I only have a couple of minutes left. So, is there anything else you want to share before we end our session with you today, our talk today?
Well, I would say that, the greatest gift that's ever happened to me was these boys, and not only because I got to be a parent, but the world was open to me in a different way. And I would never understand human beings, and I would never understand the racial confusion in this world and in our country and between the races the way I do if I had been afraid to do this.
Right.
And I really pray that it turns out to be the best thing for the boys, but I know that it was a huge gift for my life, and I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and sharing with our listeners. And I always like to say, until we meet again.
Until we meet again.
All righty.
Thanks,
Stephen. You take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. And you're listening to WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, Community Radio, and Global Soul. So this brings us to the end of our show this week. I do want to share with you that you can now access the shows. They're recorded, and you can access them now through the website for WRUU.org. You can also access them through onehumannation.info, but you can also access through wruu.org. And I encourage you to do that. And if you, hopefully if you're listening on the radio, the 107.5, and you're having difficulty here in the Savannah area, we can be streamed directly from the radio station, wruu.org. And you just scroll down and you click on the little arrow icon that you see there. So it doesn't require you to download an application. You just have to click on that little icon, and you will be able to hear the station and stream directly there. So that's been one of the changes that's been made. And as we get ready to get to the top of the hour, coming up next is going to be Troy Stoner with Sound Limit. And I will play some wonderful music from Mr. Joe Morales as you get set up for the next host.